Madam Chair, we are live and we have just started recording of the meeting.
All right, well, welcome everyone to the Planning Coordination Advisory Committee. Today's Wednesday, March 23rd. I'd like to call the meeting to order and call the roll. I can see everybody here, but I'm going to go ahead and just call everybody's name. Councilmember Salonia Miles, Councilmember Takis Karantonis, Supervisor Walter Alcorn, Supervisor Sylvia Glass, Supervisor Margaret Angela Franklin, Councilmember Sarah Bagley, Councilmember Phil Duncan, Councilmember John Steely is participating remotely this evening. And Councilmember, can you tell us why you are with us remotely and also where you are zooming in from?
I am calling from my home in the city of Fairfax, and it's because I am unable to be multiple places at once, but I can't remember, Haroon, if there's a better answer than that one. We had a family commitment that I'm required to be childcare for this evening. So.
Okay, that's a good answer. All righty. Vice Mayor Pamela Sadusky, Vice Mayor Preston Banks.
Here.
Councilmember Signe Fredericks. Here. And Vice Mayor Marty Martinez. And Councilmember Stanley Milan.
Here.
Okay, there we go. All right, has everybody looked at the meeting minutes of December 1st, 2021? Are there any changes to those minutes? Anybody see anything? Okay, all in favor? Passing those? Okay, anyone against? All right. Approval of meeting schedule for the calendar year 2022. So, Mr. Jasper?
It's in the packet.
Yes.
And it is based upon your regular meeting schedule of 4th Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. Noting no meeting is currently scheduled or intended to be scheduled for August, but due to holidays, the scheduling for your November and December meetings, if needed, will need to be something other than 4th Wednesdays. But we'll deal with that nearer the time if that's okay.
Okay.
I'd also add that your June 22nd meeting is a particularly important meeting. Not that any of them are less important, but that evening we'll be asking for your endorsements or alternative recommendations for the MBTA staff recommendations for the fiscal year 2022 to 2027 6-year program. But between the meetings between now and then will cover a lot of content related to the 6-year program as well as the transaction, and transaction will continue on into the fall.
Okay. Okay, that sounds good. Did they have any questions about the schedule? And we'll know better about November, December as we get closer to those dates. Okay. Anybody want to make a motion to approve that calendar?
Absolutely.
Okay. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay. And Councilmember John Steely has an announcement that he'd like to share with the group.
Well, thank you, Chair. Just a quick note, as part of the work I do with the Virginia Municipal League, it looks like we're going to have an event on Friday, April 22nd with MITRE at their headquarters in the Tysons area. And I found out this morning that they're thinking of the focus of that conversation to be about transportation. So this is a very soft hold. It looks like it's going to happen, but I thought this group might be interested in that. And Chair, they're welcome to contact me for any additional information. I would imagine a calendar invite will be coming out shortly, but I thought since I have the group here, I would flag the morning of Friday, the 22nd. Think 10 to noon is what's going to be shaped up at MITRE just around the corner. So appreciate the chance to share that with the group.
Okay, thank you so much. Hey, did anybody else want to have an announcement or anything? Okay. All right, moving on is the status of FY 2022-2027 6-year program update.
Thank you. I'd just like to make you aware that Dahlia Levin from our consultant team is virtual with us this evening in case there are any questions that I am unable to answer. Otherwise, we hope she has a quiet evening. I'm going to talk about the 6-year program and transaction in that order. I guess the fact that we're talking about both of them on the same evening kind of perhaps gives you a sense that there's a lot going on for us at the moment in updating the two things that are each our primary responsibility: transaction, the long-range transportation plan for Northern Virginia, and the 6-year program, which is the funding program, which I know a number of you around the table from a jurisdictional standpoint have some skin in the game. I know you'll rise above all that as we go forward. So in terms of the 6-year program, we're not sharing any analysis with you this evening, other than in your packet you have this, which is a summary of the applications that have been received, the 26 eligible projects that are under consideration. Before Monica says it, the total request of $1.2 billion is more money than we've got. So just want to manage your expectations down a little bit from where they might otherwise be. But it also in the packet, we have a map showing the locations of the projects, just to make it a little bit easier, and also some color coding that reflects the type of project that they are. Also in the email version of the packet, we provided I think a link to the project descriptions. I've got a hard copy here, but we've only printed one of these out since it's a lot of paperwork. We didn't want you to have to carry home unnecessarily when you can check online, but I'll have that here if you'd like to review it at any point. We also included, just for reference, I'm not going to talk about it, Task 1.5 technical memorandum. You recall that you were very engaged in a process over the second half of last calendar year, on the subject of goals, objectives, performance measures, and weights, which were endorsed by this committee and subsequently approved by MBTA at meetings in November and December of last year. So that kind of has now kind of fed into our analytical process, which is underway for transaction. But that's wanted to include that here. Talk about transaction in just a moment. In view of what's coming up in subsequent meetings for you, I think you've also got this in your package, which is a score sheet that we'll use for the project evaluations. All those blank cells are where we've written the scores in invisible ink. But in due course, they will actually be populated with real numbers and color coding and all sorts of wonderful things to help us and you and the public to understand what we're doing. But the reason for sharing that is not just to give you the list of projects again, but if you look at the column headings, you'll see the sorts of things that we take into account, at least summarized on this sheet. But essentially, I can shortcut that process for you a little bit. That the project selection process that we use comprises 4 components. The first is eligibility. And eligibility is behind us now. We resolved that the 26 projects we're looking at here are all eligible, which essentially means that they exist in some form in our current long-range plan. They're in Northern Virginia, and that's about the requirement for eligibility. The second component is what we call the quantitative ratings, and there are 3. These are all model-based analyses. The first and perhaps the most important is congestion reduction relative to cost. I say it's the most important because Virginia Code says MBTA shall give projects shall fund projects and give priority to those projects which achieve the greatest congestion reduction relative to costs. So that's why that one rises to the top. But Virginia Code also includes reference to a concept called long-term benefit, which states that over the long term not defined in code, over the long term, member jurisdictions will receive a benefit. Note the word benefit, not dollar or value. Receive a benefit that is approximately equal to the share of the revenues that can be attributed to each of the 9 member jurisdictions. And what that means in short is that over time, everyone gets their fair share of the money based upon what they've contributed to the regional revenue fund mostly through sales tax, but through a number of other sources as well, such as grantor's tax, but sales tax is the biggest. In December of 2014, after many months in 2014 of considering what long-term benefit means as written by the code, and turning that into something that is a bit closer to being actionable, we came up as a staff with some principles that are called that authority members actually weighed in on through a work session and subsequently approved these principles, which basically set out the approach we'll take to complying with Virginia Code with respect to long-term benefit. And what we've done subsequently, well, one of the key things was we interpreted long-term to mean after 10 years and then pretty much on a recurring basis thereafter. So our first revenue year was 2014. Fiscal year 23 would be the 10th revenue year. But the legislation was passed in 2013, so 2023 would be the 10th year. But because we allocate funds from that we have not yet received, so they're going to come in the future. We're already allocated. We've already allocated out to 2025, and now we're talking about 26 to 27 funds to allocate. So whichever definition you take, we're pretty much at or beyond 10 years. So I think now is the right time. We did look at long-term benefit on the last cycle of this update 2 years ago. We did not place a high emphasis on long-term benefit at that time in the project selection process for a number of reasons. And I think we'll definitely place a higher emphasis on long-term benefit in this, at least in developing our recommendations this cycle. But I think we probably will still be holding back from going full-blown implementation on long-term benefit. And one of the problems is, long-term benefit is not a static thing. It changes all the time. You may recall in 2018, with the Metro Funding Bill, some funds were diverted from MBTA. That actually took away the transient occupancy tax, the hotel tax, which affects jurisdictions differently based on the number of hotel beds you have in your jurisdictions. But at that point, it actually changed the trajectory of our thinking on where the revenues were going to come from, and that in turn, because it's based on a share of the revenues, meant the long-term benefit, would change just simply because the revenue streams had changed. Even without funding another project, it changed the way we look at this. So it's dynamic. We can never keep things entirely in balance. In other words, we can never make everything approximately equal. Well, we can. We can make it approximately equal. We can't make it exactly equal. We're not required to make it exactly equal anyway. But even keeping it approximately equal is a challenge because it really depends upon, not just what's recommended, but it depends on what's actually in the application for any cycle. All that's to say, long-term benefit will probably have a bigger influence this time than last time. Next time, it'll probably have a bigger influence again. The third of the quantitative scales is what was formerly called HB 599, which is legislation that was passed in 2012. And prior to MBTA actually getting a revenue stream, this legislation was established, which requires us to look at the impacts of projects related to congestion and other things we look at as well. You may recall that in the fall of last year, we were talking about measures, and we ended up with 10 measures. And so those 10 measures are taken into account in calculating what used to be called the HP 599 ratings. We now just simply refer to them as the transaction ratings, because the calculation is really driven by what happens in transaction. And HP 599 is just a moment in time, and it's probably reused every General Assembly session anyway. So that are the three quantitative scales, and then we have a whole bunch of qualitative scales, including things like, is the project a continuation project? Has it received MBTA funds before? Will we be fully funding the project if we meet the request of the project? What phases will we be funding? What level of external funds is the applicant bringing to the table to go with the MBTA funds? Is quite an important factor. Past performance is something we are increasingly looking at, and that's kind of when we say past performance, we're talking about past performance for a particular project. If it's requesting more money, how has that project performed with the money it's already had? And if it's a new project, we look at it from the perspective of how has that applicant performed across all of MBTA's project funding that they've received. And we look at both of those things together. And if it looks like a jurisdiction is really efficient at moving the money and getting the projects done on the schedule that they've told us they'll get it on, then that's great. And if they're not meeting those targets, then we take that into account. I have to say that when we measure against schedule targets and drawdown targets, we don't set those. The applicants set those when their funding is appropriated through what we call the standard project agreement process. So we measure you against the standards that you set for yourselves. We don't tell you how quickly you should build your projects or draw down the money. You tell us what you're going to do, and then we measure you against that. That's kind of how the past performance works. And you might ask, well, how do you take all these different pieces of information and come up with a recommendation? And that's a very good question. It's not as mystical as it sounds. The first thing we do is when we calculate those congestion reduction relative to cost values, this table, which is currently in alphabetical by county, by city, and by town, will be reordered with the highest performing congestion reduction relative to cost project at the top, and the lowest at the bottom. And there's also a column which I don't think we've put on here yet, because we can't put it on here yet. But when we reorder the projects based on their congestion reduction relative to cost, we add a column that kind of adds cumulatively what the total request is for each project. So as it goes down, it gets higher and higher, and eventually at the bottom it reaches $1.2 billion. And then our wonderful finance committee and finance team and under Mike Longley, our CFO, will tell us at some point, we don't know yet, but probably in the May, June sort of time frame. But before we make a recommendation, obviously, we'll be told how much money we actually have. And then it's a relatively straightforward process to draw a line across this table where everything above the line is within the amount of money we've got and everything else isn't. But that's not the end of the story, because we don't simply fund the projects at the top of the list, because remember the Virginia Code talks about shall give priority to projects that achieve the greatest congestion reduction relative to cost, but it doesn't specify that is the only basis. And so I can't say what right now because I don't know, but what will happen is some of the projects that are above that notional line, horizontal line in the table, for various reasons will not be recommended for funding. And it could be some combination of qualitative and quantitative measures other than congestion reduction cost. But some above the line will not get funded, and some below the line will get funded, or at least recommended for funding by us. What gets funded is ultimately the position of MBTA. And so that's how it's worked on previous cycles. That's how it'll work on this cycle. One thing we don't show on this table, we do every time we kind of get to the point where we're ready to make a recommendation, is to say, is that recommendation, does it represent geographic and modal balance? We would never recommend, and the authority, I'm sure, would never approve a set of projects that are concentrated in a small number of jurisdictions or are focused on a single mode, because that's just never been the way we've done this. So how that plays out over the coming weeks and months, we will see. But tonight the goal really was just to help you understand. We'll give you a refresher because I know many of you have been through this before, but some of you haven't. So we want to give a refresher as to how this process works, so that when you actually see the numbers, you may or may not agree with what we've done, but at least you will go away hoping that you understand what we've done. That's kind of like the refresher. I mean, if you like what we've done as well, that's a bonus, but that's not my goal. My goal is transparency and accountability, and beyond that, it's up to MBTA, because they're the ones who are elected or appointed into those positions to make such decisions as these. So that's kind of like an overview of the process, and then just quickly to wrap up on this item, in terms of the next steps, we have received approval from MBTA to have a public hearing on the 6-year program on May 12th, which will be at 7 p.m. And that's on the evening of the regular MBTA meeting in May, and it will precede the MBTA meeting, and it will continue until such time as everyone who's in the room who wants to give testimony has a chance to do that. Prior to that, we have, I should say, it's an in-person meeting, although we are still encouraging people to not show up if they can submit their comments in other ways, but we will include an option for phone-in on the night of the public hearing. We think that's also good as a regional transportation authority, not to make people travel from the far reaches of the region to give 3 minutes of testimony and then go all the way back again. So we will do that. Obviously, if people want to come in person, we will accept that as well. There'll be some pre-registration that has to be done in order for people to do that, but that will all be publicised well in advance. Preceding the public hearing, we will also be having an in-person open house on May 4th, and differently to what we've ever done before, we're actually having that open house at VDOT, because on May 4th there is an annual regional transportation coordination meeting, which is also required by Virginia Code. Actually, the original bill was authored by Delegate LaRock, who is now an authority member. That's a meeting which also coincides with the Commonwealth's hearing on the Smart Scale and 6-year improvement program. But preceding their public hearing, there's an open house, and we will take space there to have our open house, which is, for us, is perfect, because that meeting is always intended to show regional collaboration, and we think there's no better way to show that than to turn up and actually have meaningful public interactions. So that'll be on May 4th. The public comment period itself will begin on April 15th, and it will continue until 10 days after the public hearing on May 22nd. And that the public comment packet will comprise of a version of a map that's in your packet this evening, a completed version of this document. It'll still be on one page, and then these 2-page documents for the 26 projects. We've got a specific page on our website that has other information, including a long list of frequently asked questions that people can go to and just kind of track along with schedule and so on, and other interesting and relevant information. So that's actually available now. I mean, that's built up. These documents aren't on there yet, but there's a lot of background information already on the website. In June, at the June authority meeting, we will present the findings of the public comment period, taking into account of public comments that are submitted to us online and testimony from the hearing. And I didn't mention this earlier, but I said there are 4 components to our process, and I talked about eligibility, quantitative, qualitative. The 4th component is public comments. So, we can't make recommendations until we've got the public comments, obviously. So we will be presenting the public comment summary at the June authority meeting. We will also begin the process with this committee and the other committees in June to share with you the MBTA staff recommendations, for which we'll be looking for a recommendation, endorsement, sorry, or change if you don't agree. And then the plan is to go to the MBTA's regular meeting in July to adopt the 6-year program. So that's the big picture, and there'll be more to come in subsequent meetings. And we will share with you the completed version of this and the packet either immediately preceding or on the day of the beginning of public comment, so you have the same information, and you'll have that information for your meeting in April. I'm not sure exactly what's going to be on your agenda, your meeting in April, but I'm sure about it. Without having to take any questions.
Okay. Any questions? Yeah. Great.
Thanks, Keith, for your overview. I know you mentioned it, there's 1.2 requested for funding, and then 3 billion for the projected cost in total. So that's a lot. Do you have like an estimate or a guess on the cutoff on the projects, the candidate projects that will make it or not?
I'm looking to.
We do not. We're working on the revenue projection numbers now. We will go to the finance committee and ask the finance committee to approve or make a recommendation to the authority to approve the number. I know, and you all are probably aware, there's a lot of talk about suspension of gas tax and repeal of the grocery tax. We are indirectly impacted, and what I mean by that, you noted earlier, the bulk of our revenues come from sales tax. We do get funding from grantors tax, and then we get a 20 million off the top from the state, and then we get what we call, or what is now called the Interstate Operations and Enhancement Fund, formerly known as I-81. Those I-81 monies and the 20 million from off the top from the state could very well be comprised of some gas tax dollars, because when the legislation changed, it says all of these transportation funds essentially goes into the Commonwealth Transportation Fund and are divvied, if you will, that way. But the impact to us is negligible. The CFO of VDOT reported to CTV last week that we should be receiving about 20-something million for I-81 money. Hopefully we'll get it. we're still trying to have conversations, but the bulk of our revenues comes from sales tax. But having said that, we're trying to dot our I's and cross our T's. With the grocery tax, I was asked, hey, does that impact MBTA? HB 2313 exempted us from receiving the grocery tax. We don't receive revenues from the grocery tax. It's part of the wholesale tax. That's what, so we should have information in the May front timeframe. It may be earlier, but I believe the April Finance Committee was canceled. And you heard it here first. But we are working on those numbers, but it's really a little too soon to tell. Additionally, what is going on with Smart Scale, since apparently we're just swimming in the transportation surplus, with Smart Scale, technically they're working on FY 2028, but they're going to advance fund, if you will, and they said that they're going to use these funds instead of funding FY 2028, they're going to fund FY 2026. So the applications for Smart Scale are actually due sometime in August, which is the month after we adopt our funding program. So it does have some overlap, if you will, but applicants can know what the authority funded versus an application they want to put forward for Smart Scale. The thing is about Smart Scale, though, you have to have a pre-application in order to submit that final application.
Right.
They want any applications that you submit, you have to have that pre-application. So that's a long way of saying, no, Vice Mayor. We're not there just yet, but we are working on the numbers.
And so you said the gas tax, I'm sorry, not the gas tax, the grocery store tax doesn't affect you.
Not
The
directly.
bills do.
It's indirectly because it does impact transit and transportation in general.
Right.
And so while it's not a part of the revenues we receive, we don't pay operations, we don't pay maintenance, and that's where we think that we'll see a lot of the impact, in addition to transportation responsibilities that the Commonwealth will have to undertake. My main concern is it's not an immediate problem per se. This is something we will see more on the, I don't even want to call it long term, maybe 4 or 5 years from now, because we do have stimulus money, but that isn't dedicated revenue. And it will run out one day. So we're having this conversation about a surplus, but it's not as if we have dedicated money.
Right.
We will get to the point, and I'm sure they're counting the stimulus monies and some of the new monies from the IIJA. But again, the IIJA, a lot of it is continuing ongoing current transportation funding programs. So I'm really concerned about what this will mean in year 4, year 5, you know, regarding where we are on transportation revenue, because if you hear the General Assembly, oh, you know, they're gonna have funding for schools and the like, but transportation is not going to be replaced. So what will that mean in the longer term?
I share that concern because it sounds like you've got some permanent revenue losses going on.
And what I know, our legislative liaison working with MBTC liaison, trying to get language in that really requires a look back, if you will, or an assessment on where we are come year 4, year 5. Where are we regarding transportation and transportation revenue?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Councilmember Frederick.
So we've all, I think those of us who have skin in the game have all received our evaluations or are getting ready to receive our evaluations. And one of the questions I had about the technical, you know, when you see an evaluation, you go, that's what they were, so my question is basically, once we set out the technique by which, or the things that we were going to use to evaluate each application, who looked at the applications themselves and figured out, well, this will reduce this and that will increase this and so forth? Was that a staff just sort of going through and saying, okay, well, this will reduce congestion by this much and that will, you know, improve multimodality by this much? Who does that process?
It's a combination of us and our consultant, represented by Dalia Levin this evening. The MBTA currently does not have in-house modeling capability. That is a strategic plan target for MBTA to have that in-house. We've taken some steps, but we're not there yet. So until such time as we could do this in-house, it has to be outsourced. So for those quantitative scales I refer to, congestion reduction relative to cost, long-term benefit, and HB 599 or transaction project ratings. These are all model-based analyses, and the way we work this varies depending on which particular quantitative scale we're talking about. But essentially, the projects that have been submitted to our online portal are then coded to be included into a digital version of the transportation network. What we do is using COG TPB's travel demand model as a basis, which basically tells us where people travel from and to and why. We overlay that kind of travel behavior onto the digital network. Our digital networks are more sophisticated, probably is not the right word, but more disaggregated, more detailed than the COGS travel model, because Virginia code actually requires us to have something that COGS model would not meet the requirement for. We have think about it as like a with and without type of comparison. We run the model without the project, and then we run the model with the project, and we compare the two, and from that we begin to calculate the impacts.
So another question might be, when you do that, are you looking at current traffic and current congestion, or are you extrapolating from the knowledge you have about other developments coming in? Because I think when we were discussing this, we said that we were trying to figure out how this would impact localities 10 years from now or 5 years from now. And if we're looking at current traffic and current development, for example, Walter and I share a boundary, but our streets go between, and when they do a big project in Reston, it has an impact on Herndon. Now, I know that Herndon and Reston, and I know all kinds of other places too, have a lot of building in the pipeline. Are the models taking that into account, or are they just looking at what we know we have now and what we anticipate an increase in population?
Right. Well, the simple answer to the question is yes, we take it into account. We do use current day conditions as part of what we call our model validation process, because to validate the model, you need to compare what the model is saying against reality as we see it today. So that kind of gives us a sense that the model is performing well under today's conditions, which is about as far as we can go, without using a lot of artificial intelligence to do something similar to that for the future. But the actual model runs we do for the analysis I described, for congestion reduction relative to cost, we look at 2030 and 2045. And this is again using the COG models as the basis for the travel demand. So we're entirely consistent with what the region has developed. And those travel demands for those future years are based upon what localities such as yourselves and Fairfax and others provide through, probably through the planning directors into a process which is called Cooperative Planning Forecasts, which is administered by COG and the Transportation Planning Board on behalf of the entire DC metro region. And every few years they do some major additional synthesis if there's a major update. But if your planning directors have told COG what's in your future plans, then you can rest assured we take it into account. Now, obviously, you and we don't know exactly what will be in a particular lot in 2045. But take, for example, Amazon's HQ2 in National Landing, as it's now called. We never knew whose name was going to be on that building. But we knew, because Arlington told us, that there was going to be this amount of development, this square footage, and we understand, population growth, household size, job forecast, and just a reference, for 2045, we're looking at in the mid-20s percent, like around 24% is population growth for this region. For Northern Virginia, the job growth is around 35%, between now and 2045. That's built into the model. So whatever your people best guess is of what's going to be there is our best guess as well. Now, if something dramatic changes, then it could be off. But you don't know that, and we don't know that, so we can only go with what we know.
Well, and when we discuss modeling at our last few meetings, we discussed that the consultants were going to come up with their own model, that they weren't going to use the COG model, they were going to create their own, and that is what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. They have created a kind of like a bespoke model for us for Northern Virginia, which includes well beyond Northern Virginia as well. But it is, in terms of the travel demand patterns that are in that model, it is fully consistent with the COG model. What they've really built that's different is the refinement in the way COG's model kind of puts that travel demand into travel behavior on the transportation system by multiple modes. So it's not just a highway model. We're assigning riders on transit. We're looking at express lanes and HOV lanes. A whole range of things, which actually is. I know the town doesn't have its own model. And Triplex County does have a county-wide model. The development of our model has taken on board the experts from those jurisdictions that have their own models. So, Triplex County model leader was a part of our team together with staff from TPB, and BDOT, Arlington, Prince William, Loudon, I may be missing one. But all the region's experts in modeling helped us through this process of deciding, what the model would be. And all our models actually are all consistent with each other. But when a county does its own model, it's tailored for the county's needs. We've done the same thing. We've tailored it for the region's needs, but it's all built off the same basis, which is the travel demand from COG and also the travel networks. I would actually even say we're going one step further there, because as part of our process, we're identifying some minor errors in the COG model that have not been fixed, that we're actually fixing on their behalf, or identifying on their behalf and fixing in our model. So we, it's a difficult thing to do. I'm not criticizing COG. I mean, it's really hard to know if a road layout changes. It happens all the time, all over the region. You can't track every single one of them. But every now and again, you realize, oh, that's not coded right. And we found a few of those this time with the help of jurisdictional staff. And so I'd say, we're fully consistent, but we're more sophisticated, more advanced, because we have to be, because there's parts of the Virginia code that say, we have to use simulation modeling. The sorts of analyses that we need to do cannot be done with the COG model.
So the overlay that you were describing a couple of questions ago, that overlay that's much more granular, that's what you're talking
That's
about.
a very good way of saying it, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do you want me to move on to transaction?
Please do.
But I would say that, the model we're using for the 6-year program, we initially built for transaction. The goal here is that we're using the same model for both. I would also say for smaller jurisdictions, subject to future staffing at MBTA and MBTA and subject to future needs, there's no reason in theory why the model that we build couldn't also be used by you for your projects if you don't have one. That's not to say that's an offer that is available today, because we don't have the staff today, and also too busy right now. Anyway, you've got to wait until this year's over at least before we're in a position to actually deliver on that.
That's good to hear though, because the staff has discussed borrowing, gathering that.
And to be honest with you, we've already had inquiries, I can't say from whom, but we've had inquiries from within Northern Virginia to use the model for a specific purpose that we did not create it for, but for which it would be very appropriate. So, I mean, the demand is there to use it. Absolutely, the demand is there to use it.
It really, really is.
We can talk later. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So the model development started with transaction. It's been a really big piece of transaction. We did change our consultant for this update cycle, and that was partly related because related to the fact we're moving towards a modeling approach that made us more consistent. What we had before was equally sophisticated, but it wasn't easily replicable, and it wasn't consistent with what our member jurisdictions were doing or COG either. So so we're still building our internal capabilities with this model, and actually Haroon is my guy who's leading this effort. So in terms of transaction, we divided the work out into 3 phases. In 3 phases. Phase 1 was really looking at the high degree of public engagement, getting inputs from the public on priorities and needs and so on. Phase 3 is an upcoming formal public comment process. But right now we're in phase 2, which is much more inward looking, a lot of number crunching essentially going on with the consultants and with your staff helping us out with various things. So I'll talk first about what we're doing in phase 2 of transaction with respect to public engagement, because there wasn't a whole lot of need for public engagement, but we didn't want to lose the momentum from phase 1 and have to rebuild it again for phase 3. So to keep that momentum going during phase 2, we've done a couple of things. At the last authority meeting, we presented the results of our 2021 Transportation Perception Survey. It's done by the same consultant team. This is a great kind of snapshot at a point in time about how 600 Northern Virginians feel about transportation. But because we repeat it, we get a longitudinal trend as well. So we can see how perceptions change over time, as well as how they are most recently. So that was a very interesting presentation. Obviously, with the pandemic, to what extent it's an outlier remains to be seen. If nothing else, what we did in 2021 will serve as a new benchmark, so we can kind of monitor the development of the new normal going forwards. But it's all posted online. If you'd like more information on that, I'd be happy to give that to you. We're also doing some of what we're calling blogs. They're not strict blogs because we're not really encouraging a whole lot of discussion after we post things, but we are posting on the transaction website some bite-sized pieces of narrative which will eventually find its way into the transaction plan. So it's beginning to tell the story of transaction. And if you and some of your staff have a chance to take a look at this, we'd love to get feedback from them as we go. But so we've had one that's talked about, the transaction process and the way planning and programming is integrated at MBTA. We've had one that's looked at growth. We've just done one that looks at future travel demands, which is really fascinating when you look at where people are traveling from and to the jobs in particular. It's amazing how it's easy to get a perception that everyone in Northern Virginia works in Washington DC. That really is not the case. Most people in Northern Virginia stay in Northern Virginia. Obviously, a chunk of people do go to DC. They're mostly working from home now, which is another change we've got to monitor. The majority of people who work in Northern Virginia actually work in Fairfax County. I say majority, about half. It may not be the majority. It's definitely the plurality. And of those people who work in Fairfax County, getting on for half of those are in the Tysons area. And I say that not because I kind of want to big up Fairfax County or anything like that, but you have to understand that, so you understand trip making behavior in the future and what that means for transportation. So that's all part of our process. We're telling that story, and there's probably going to be at least another 8 blog pieces that we'll be putting on there in a not too distant future. We'll be doing one that kind of touches on mobility and accessibility and looks at that subject of could people walk or bike to work? It's not for us to judge whether people could or should walk or bike to work, but what we will do is look at what we call the Triplex Distribution. The average trip length for a work trip in Northern Virginia is about 15 or 16 miles one way, average. I can tell you mine is well above the average. And some of you probably travel well above the average to get here this evening as well. But that's not to say that a lot of people have a very short work commute trip. And we want to pull that out because it's important to understand that when we talk about what solutions work and what solutions won't work. You can't realistically expect people to bike to work if their commute is 30 miles. Even if it's 2 miles, you may not be able to reasonably expect them to do that if it's not safe, if it's perceived to not be safe to do that. So these are very important parts of the process. A lot of this stuff is going on behind the scenes right now. We're releasing bits and pieces as we go through, with these blogs. We have a project list which is, just above 400 projects long. It contains 400 projects. We're finalizing that now. A lot of those projects come out of your comp plans. There are some projects that don't appear in comp plans, like a regional bus rapid transit system doesn't really find a natural home in anyone's comp plan. A number of you, I think we're funding pretty much all of these to some degree. A number of you have bus rapid transit projects, including probably the biggest one in the Commonwealth in Fairfax County. I'll say this for Monica does $250 million of MBT money just on the BRT piece of that project. So it's really important to us as it is really important to the county. There are 5 BRT projects in Northern Virginia, but there isn't a BRT regional system in Northern Virginia. So one of the things we've done as part of the transaction process is to actually create a working group with all of your staff, but also with staff from Montgomery County, Georges County, the District of Columbia, VDOT and DRPT, obviously, MBTC, PRTC. So we've got a broad range of opinions on bus rapid transit, which is one of the things that people are crying out for through our surveys. They really would love to have a choice other than to drive, but they don't. So what sort of choice would make them consider not driving? We consider that the best chances is a fast, frequent, reliable bus rapid transit system, not just a bunch of individual lines that are not really connected in any meaningful way, but a system for Northern Virginia. So that is being modeled in transaction, and that's the sort of project that doesn't appear in comp plans, other than in maybe some of the component pieces. Technology projects tend to not naturally sit in comp plans, although they are beginning to a little bit more now compared to 5 years ago. And also a certain amount of regional bike and trail type projects. There's a decent amount of that in there, but we wanted to double check to make sure that we were doing a good job in looking at regional bike paid options too. So that project list is being finalized. Dahlia at previous meetings has talked to you about the scenario or sensitivity analysis that we're doing, which is looking at different alternate futures other than the one that all our models suggest will happen. You know, it's not that we aren't confident in our models, we are confident in our models, but we have to be realistic and say, you know, there could be a pandemic new normal. Technology could emerge at a different pace than what we're expecting and might do things that we're not expecting. Yeah, there may be some public policy initiatives which take things like the express lane experience, and in particular the inside the Beltway 66 and 3995 experience, where you know, toll revenues at peak times are a share of toll revenues at peak times are ploughed back into transportation investments to provide alternatives to driving that are funded through tolls. So, you know, we're looking at more broadly at the question of incentives, what would incentivize people to do things differently, and if that involves, you know, a cost, and actually even if it doesn't involve a cost, you know, what kind of combination of incentives and pricing type approaches could work, be that tolling or parking or something else. These are all theoretical things. No one's actually proposing policy at this stage that this should be done. We wanted to look to see what those impacts might be, particularly if the last update to transaction, the current transaction basically continues to show, you know, in the next update that in the future years, no matter what we do, travel conditions on many of the region's transportation systems are going to be pretty bleak in terms of quality of service, comfort of service, congestion, and so on. So, you know, physical infrastructure probably is not sufficient on its own. Some combination of physical and policy type approaches might work better, and that's what we're exploring as part of that scenario analysis. In terms of schedule, we're looking at public comment on transaction over the summer, with a public hearing in the fall, adoption by the end of the year. And interestingly, what this means is that if everything stays to schedule, in July, at the July authority meeting, when we request that they adopt their 6-year program, on the same evening, we'll be requesting they approve the date for a public hearing and open house public comment period for the transaction as well. So we'll keep busy for the rest of the year. And the good thing is from July onwards, we'll only be dealing with one of our 2 primary responsibilities rather than both of them, which is what we're dealing with right now. So I think I've probably gone on long enough, and we'll take any questions.
Any questions? Covered everything, I think. Perfect. Okay. Ms. Foster.
Well, and in the interest of time, I will be brief. We are looking to hold a work session with the authority on transaction. We're trying to schedule that sometime in May. We're trying to get everyone's schedules and get the date that allows us the maximum participation. This is a year where we are updating the 6-year program and transaction. So I would say after the December adoption of transaction, we probably won't hear from us regarding this committee for a little bit anyway, to give everyone a break. We are following what's going on in the General Assembly now that the special session the date has been announced, April the 4th. So we will be following that. There are some bills that could relate to this committee meeting virtually. but we will see what happens because there's language that says, and this is my paraphrasing of the bill. If you are not if it's a committee that really doesn't, if you make a recommendation versus making a decision, you may be allowed to meet virtually, but we'll see what comes out of that. I know certain committees are exempt, like planning commissions or thing committees, and certain commissions, school boards and things like that. But in talking to our attorneys, we think that this committee would be allowed to do so. So we're going to, of course, monitor that and see what the final outcome is. We would, need to have a policy, if you will, that allows that. So if the bill is adopted as written today, based on our understanding of who it applies to and who it doesn't, I would try to get a policy in front of the authority to adopt at their July meeting. So our subsequent meeting for the rest of the year, we could have some virtual meeting opportunity. And I believe, Madam Chair, that is all.
Any questions? All right, I guess we're done. The next meeting is April 27th. All right, there we go. Good evening, everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't you wish your budget meetings were this quick, huh?
Oh, get it done.
Anyway,
I know that one of the.
You ready to go to- had the cookie and everything, huh?
Yeah.
Water.